Thank you for joining me for this episode of God Talk. And we are mixing it up a little bit on this episode of God Talk. I'm actually doing an interview. There's been a few other times I've thought about doing this, and it's never happened. But I was having a conversation with one of the members of my church a few weeks ago, and he works in the financial industry. And we were just talking about a bunch of different things, and I was thinking, man, that would make a really, really good podcast. So I've brought in one of my members, Brian Krukiel, who's worked in the financial industry for a number of years. And we're going to talk a little bit about money because money is a huge stressor to people. I don't know if it's still the case, but when I went through seminary and I became certified in this one counseling program, at least at that time, money was the number one reason for divorce, not affairs. Not cocaine habits, people getting drunk all the time, money. And so because that's a big issue, because it's mentioned a lot in the Bible, I brought Brian in because I knew he could give some practical advice on how to help people get out of sometimes the financial chaos that they find themselves in. So, Brian, thank you so much for joining me today for this podcast. And how many years have you been in the financial industry?
Gosh, going on 20 years. You know, I came in, believe it or not, right in the midst of the financial crisis in 2008.
Okay, wow.
Trial by fire.
Right?
Know? Yes.
Right. Just kind of off topic, like, what are some of the changes you've seen over the years that you've been in this industry?
Changes I've seen with regard to the industry, or just
maybe even like people's debt load, just like, is it this, like some things are the same today as what they've always been, or are things like fundamentally, have they changed over those 20 some years?
Yeah. I think that it's a lot of the same, but ultimately I think that, with the way that society has evolved has really kind of exacerbated and made what we once thought wasn't okay more okay. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Now you've taught, as recent as, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago, you taught a Bible class on Sunday morning about God and money, basically. So what makes money a God issue? So this is God Talk. You've done a Bible class for me before. Dave Ramsey is famous for weaving together kind of faith and finances, but like in your own experiences and in your own words, why is money a God issue?
I think that money is one of those things. At the end of the day, there's a parable in Matthew. I think it's Matthew 6:24, and correct me if I'm wrong, where this word mammon is used, right? And it's only used a couple of times in Scripture, and it's only in the King James Version. And to my surprise, believe it or not, I came across this whenever I was preparing for that study. And, that word mammon is used to describe, well, in other translations, it uses money, right? But in the original text, it's the word mammon is used. And that word mammon is ultimately describing the thing at which we put our ultimate faith and security and trust in. And so I think from the beginning, God knew, Jesus knew that we were going to have struggles, with things of this world, and ultimately power and control, is two inherent elements that, we all struggle with. And so when it comes to money, money gives us a sense of power, control, safety, security, and I think it's that delicate balance between like, where is our faith? Where does it lie? And what do we really believe in? And so
it comes to mind another passage, one of my favorite, where your treasure is, there your heart will be. And so actually that's how it says in the Bible. I like it the other way around. Where your heart is, there your treasure will be. I mean, it works both ways, but that's where I think money becomes a God issue, is because it interferes with people's relationship with God, being able to live out what God calls for them to live out in their faith, right?
It sure does.
Okay, good. So what I want this podcast to be is just like around 30 minutes of some practical advice that the people that are listening can use to at least maybe get their handle on some things that they might be struggling with financially. So my first question to you is this. What are the worst mistakes people make in terms of their money and managing their money?
I think it starts with as basic and simple as almost unbelievably, basic is really it's controlling your spending. I think that we find it so easy to like justify things, right? I need that, and it's I think so oftentimes, when I talk with people, the common denominator is there is no budget, and I think oftentimes we tie that word budget in our brain, it hits that scarcity nerve, and it shouldn't, right? Instead of budget, maybe we use a different word, call it a spending plan.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately it's how we choose to allocate our money. And if we're not intentional about that, right, our money's going to choose for us. And so most oftentimes what I see is people are just like, there's not enough month at the end of my paycheck.
Right.
And so there's a lot of reasons for that, that we can go into, but ultimately that to me seems to be the common denominator. So
I think you're totally right. To me, it's like the diet and exercise. People sit there and they exercise all day long, but what they realize is it's 90% diet, right? And so the same thing with, you can make a ton of money, but if you're not disciplined in how you spend it, you're broke and you're in debt. So, assuming that some of the people that are listening to this are making that mistake, what's your top suggestion or two? Obviously make a budget, but, give some practical advice to people in that situation.
Sure. I mean, and I like to start at the highest level possible, in an effort to not unnecessarily complicate things. And I think at the end of the day, it's like having a, create 2 checking accounts, right? Have a fixed account and a variable account, right? And inside of that fixed account, right, your fixed expenses are going to be things that really don't change every month. Call it your mortgage payment, your insurance, your utility bills, right? Those are going to come and they must be paid, right? And then the variable bucket is things like, your groceries, you're going out to eat money, and things of that nature, right? I could happy to elaborate more, but ultimately it's like your fixed expenses are X, and whatever's left in your paycheck, that's the capacity, for that variable bucket, and you've got to make it work. Stop using the credit card, for going out to eat, so oftentimes I see people spending so much money at the grocery store, right? And it's relatively easy, to put some controls around that. Another interesting thing that I find is that when people aren't aware of their spending plan and they're just, spending as if, I need these things, so I'm going to buy them anyway. Just by paying attention, studies show that people spend about 20% less every month. So I just think creating awareness around that, and having a fixed and variable bucket, is a great way to start.
Do you have any success stories, that, people that were living paycheck to paycheck and probably, still getting further and further in debt, like people who've turned it around? Does any story come to mind that because I feel like people need to be able to see the path of what it really looks like to do it. So part of it is be aware of what you're spending. But what if they can't really reduce or whatever? Like any story come to mind of someone that was able to turn that around?
Yeah. I mean, everything is so nuanced, right? And there's no just black and white, like, hey, spend less and you're going to be okay. I mean, and this really opens up things to, go down some rabbit holes. But I mean, I certainly think that, society and, governments and, just the way that we live today has contributed to, the lack of just general financial awareness, and kind of just enabled the issue to be significantly exacerbated. Right. But, I think the story that comes to my mind is actually, young couple that I was working with. It was just, in that problem, right? They had way too much more month left at the end of their paycheck, and one of the issues with this particular couple, and they were a young couple with kids, wife stayed at home. The husband was he was college educated and had a good job, but he just wasn't earning enough. He wasn't earning enough for what he was worth, And so, so the first step is like helping them create a spending plan, but outside of that, it was helping him acknowledge and believe, not just hear, but having him acknowledge and believe that he was worth more.
So what's interesting, let me just interject for a second. So one of the big issues with money may be comfortableness. Like you're comfortable overspending, you don't want to change that. And you might be comfortable in a job that like you could be getting paid more, but because you're comfortable, you're not like getting paid what you're worth. So, I mean, would you agree that being like our desire to be comfortable and continue to do what we normally do can be a huge barrier?
I absolutely. I mean, it bleeds into so many other elements of our lives, particularly as it relates to our spiritual walk. I mean, I think I love the slogan, comfort is a slow death, prefer pain, because if you're not pushing the envelope on stepping out of your own comfort zone, I mean, you're holding yourself up, but you're also holding up people around you, your family, your kids, your friends, and so I always try to, I intentionally try to make myself uncomfortable on a regular basis and encourage people to do that because, what is comfort, right? It's not pushing yourself to become better.
So that was a rabbit hole, which I can take responsibility for. But all right, get back to your story about this couple. So you're trying to teach him, his real worth and value and so forth, and where to go from there.
Sure, and yeah, and so like with what he was earning, and again, mom stayed at home, so he was working, and with what he was earning, it was pretty clear for us to determine that he should be earning more, and so with some encouragement, and this was a process that probably took 6+ months of working together. But he went and sat through several interviews and ultimately landed a job making 50% more than he was.
Wow.
Right.
That solves a lot of problems.
Oh, it significantly, man. And then, he was able to, that whole spending plan that they were on, right? They had a lot more paycheck left at the end of their month. Right. And so now they're able to, emphasize on some of these things that they weren't able to before, like saving for college, saving for retirement, and not having to have arguments about, how much money they're able to spend on groceries and everything like that. So it really did change their life.
That's awesome. I'm a strong believer in when you put God first, God blesses your life. And so, starting in college, I began to tithe, and I've tithed ever since, even when I started out and was getting paid $30,000 a year. And, it was only my income, and my house had foundation problems. And then, when one of my kids had some serious health issues for a couple different years, we just continued to tithe. And I've seen that God blesses that. How important do you think, since this is God talk and we're kind of looking at how money and spirituality weave together, how significant is generosity, you think, in looking at people's overall financial health?
Oh gosh, that's such a hairy subject, Pastor Greg. Because there are reasonable arguments to suggest that hey, if you're struggling financially, maybe you put tithing on hold, right?
Right.
And I can understand that, it's logical. But what I've learned to believe is that the ultimate test of faith, the ultimate, putting yourself in a position to where you are trusting in God, if you really say that you do, what's your mammon, right? And if we're putting our faith and our security, that thing in which we trust is our ability to financially take care of our family, etc., it just makes me question, right? Like, is that my mammon, right? Or am I putting that into, is my trust in the Lord, And so I think that the ultimate test of faith is, for a lot of people, right, is their money, And so I think it's really important, and I would encourage, and maybe it's not 10% out of the gate, maybe if you're not at all, maybe you start at 1, maybe you start at 3,
Yeah, for sure.
But try it,
Right.
I mean, would you agree that it's an opportunity to, like, in addition to test your faith, but test God?
Well, I mean, the Bible says that, right? The last book of the Old Testament, it says you're robbing God, and it says the Lord your God, test me on this and see that I don't fill your grain houses, and I'll keep the vines that would normally choke out your crops, and I'll keep them from sprouting. God actually does tell us to test them in that. So yeah, and I'm with you totally. I tell people that all the time. Like, if you're already at your spending capacity, yeah, it's probably not the best financial decision. Just start writing checks for 10%. But what I'd like to tell them at least is, when you get a pay raise, don't increase your standard of living. Put God first until you get to that level.
Sure, but I mean, I want to catch on that though. You said maybe it's not the best financial advice to start stroking a check for 10%, right? But
right.
I don't know. It's like, the unique thing about Scripture and our belief is that a lot of things don't make logical sense in our humanness. They literally don't add up. And that's one thing that I've realized over time, is that so many things in my life I literally can't compute with logic and reason.
Yeah, no, I agree with you totally. But I was just jumping on, like you said, it might not be 10%, it might be 1%,
sure,
or 3%. So, but start that journey.
Right. Give it a try.
Yeah.
Like I said, it defies logic, like so many other things do. With faith in God and that spiritual walk.
Do you have any story that stands out on someone that's trusted God in that way, and they got a check, or something worked out financially that they didn't plan on? Like, have you seen that?
The thing that comes to my mind is my little brother. My brother, he's a school teacher and he's a coach. The guy works 100 hours a week. His wife's a teacher as well. They've got 2 kids, new baby. I mean, their collective household income is not as high as 2 people working in the corporate world.
Right.
But like my brother and I, we're each other's rock. He's leaned on me for years and I lean on him for things too. And one thing that he takes everything I say at face value. Right. And not to say that I, give the best advice all the time, because I certainly don't. But one thing that I've seen my brother do is practice financial discipline, but he's also tithed above 10%.
Wow.
In fact, we were having a conversation about this the other day, and so what's crazy is like, I meet people all the time that make, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 that, have these financial goals that they're not able to achieve, or, they just have, financial struggles or angst, or, arguments in their relationships and everything like that. But it's like, man, my brother's rocking and rolling, and it's like, so to me, that's a testament that, like, if 2 teachers, not to pick on teachers, but we know that teachers,
for sure,
you don't become a teacher to get rich, right? They're passionate about what they do, and they love being a lighthouse for a lot of these for children, and so I look at it and say, what, if this guy can do it, I would assume that a lot of folks can do it.
And that's interesting. Like, having been a pastor for 26 years, in general, the biggest givers aren't the people that make the most. It's not usually the people that are, making minimum wage, of course, but it tends to be, from my perspective, like the story of your brother. Like, you got 2, you got middle class money, right? And yet they put God first, and they're able to make their bills meet in the way, like you said, someone that's making maybe 300,000, 400,000 isn't able to, just because, once again, their priorities are straight.
That's right? It. And listen, I know that if there was somebody else sitting in this room with us today, they could easily, rock our boat and disagree. And it's with logic and reason, I can't argue that. Right. But with a lot of what we're talking about isn't necessarily logic and reason. But the other thing that I want to make sure that we emphasize or don't skip over is like heart posturing with regard to giving. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I'd be kind of curious to hear your perspective on it. But for me, everything goes back to that passage. Like for you, it's the mammon one. But for me, where your heart is, there your treasure will be. And so I always say, and I always teach, I think you need to look at like what you spend your money on. Like for me personally, my tithe is higher than my mortgage payment. I could have a higher mortgage payment. I mean, I could, but I choose not to. Not only so, like I like that my number one expense in my life. I'm just speaking it secularly. Like the tithe is an expense, but like my number one expense is what I give to God. If my mortgage was higher, if my car payments, like if my credit card, like debt that I carried, like if those things were higher, then I might still be able to tithe, but then can I do those extra things? Like, I went to the grocery store the other day and I was, starting to check out and I decided to buy a gift card for the 78-year-old lady, 80-year-old lady that was monitoring all the self-checkouts. Well, just because I felt moved to, and I felt bad for her because it was a busy day, right? So like we can do those things when we don't put materialism in the things of this world as the most important thing in our lives.
Yep. Yeah. I where I go to is, it's clear in scripture that, God loves a cheerful giver, right? In fact, if you give in a way that isn't cheerful, or if you give in a way that's like, hey, I got to check this box, right?
Yeah.
You may as well just not be giving.
Yeah.
Right? Just don't do it. And maybe you're not ready yet. Right. But I think that back to, testing God, right? It's like, try it with a little bit and do it with a loving heart. It wasn't ours to begin with.
Right.
And here in the US, at least, by the world standards, I mean, we're all relatively well off.
For sure.
And so I think that it's just important to acknowledge that, like with giving, doing it with the correct heart posture, doing it cheerfully, is if you're not doing it that way, you may as well not be doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you totally on that. All right, we've got about 8 more minutes left, and so you can just go on a stream of consciousness here. You can answer my last question for you, or you can choose to go in other directions. But once again, I like practical advice, and I like practical preaching and teaching, just to help people like see, smell, taste, like know how to move forward in their lives, those that are in this financial chaos. So my final question to you, and if you want to veer off and go down some rabbit holes instead, what are the steps, the big steps to getting out of financial chaos? Like you mentioned budgeting, but heart posturing, but like, are there other things that you would suggest that people look at or do? Like maybe you don't use credit cards. Like one things that I've always done is like you said, like your mortgage is going to be your mortgage, your car payment's going to be your car payment, whatever. I have the term, and when I do counseling, like play money, and I tell people take out in cash once a month, whatever your play money is. That way, if your spouse wants to go to Starbucks every day, great, as long as they can do it within their play money. And because I find that people like overspend all their stops to the QT or to McDonald's or to like the $10 here, $10 there, and so forth. Like, so that's just like some things that I do. What's some practical advice and things that in the last few minutes that we have that you'd want to throw out to our listeners that they should maybe consider doing? Sure.
And I'll start with a little story. So back when I was actually in the Navy right out of high school, spent 4 years in the Navy. And through that, when I was 18 years old, I bought a motorcycle. And I love that thing. It was so much fun. But I totaled it. And, because I was, I couldn't help myself, but to do things that I shouldn't do, totaled it. And, I didn't have insurance on it because insurance was too expensive. So I had to, and I had a loan on it from Navy Federal Credit Union. So I had to work really hard to pay that off. When it was paid off, it felt great. You know what I did after it was paid off? I bought another motorcycle.
Right.
that motorcycle was also too expensive to insure. And
no.
believe it or not, that motorcycle was stolen.
Oh, man.
Okay. So while I think motorcycles are awesome, and, and parallel to, I think credit cards can be awesome too, right? You get all these reward points and airfare tickets and things of that nature, but it just wasn't a right fit for me, right? It encouraged, it opened up the door for potential bad behavior.
Oh, I like that.
And so I think with regard to finances, it's like, ask yourself, what can this lead to? And what are my human tendencies, right? And so I think with being honest with yourself, about like,
for different people, those might be different things, right?
100%, right? Like I use a credit card every month. My wife and I do, and pay the balance in full, right? But, that's a discipline that I've had to practice and learn over time. I used to not be that way. And so I think that there's, ultimately there's, I think, practical steps. And maybe it starts with, using cash, right? Even when you use your debit card, you go pump 2 tanks full of gas over the weekend, and sometimes that money doesn't come out of your checking account until Tuesday or Wednesday, and so I think just, making it easier for yourself, I think is, things that are just, kind of simple to implement, right? And that transition can be a little bit painful because it's something new, but I think finding ways to make it easier for yourself not to get in, step in a trap is number one. And I'm just rambling.
Yeah,
here,
no,
right?
I like it.
But number two is like, don't follow most of the advice that you see on, online, on X, on Facebook. Most of it is like, fix yourself quick. Right. Mm. And, if I'm being really honest, there's people out there that, the help they need and to get out of this, the hole that they're in, it might take 5 years. Right. And you know what, if it is what it is. Right. And so I think that it starts, the light at that end of the tunnel, they might not see it for 2 or 3 or 4 years.
Right.
And so that's just the reality of it. And so I think that just, time.
That's hard in an instant gratification society though.
It is. But I think that, our culture and our society, combined with the fact that like there is no personal finance knowledge embedded in our education system. Most adults aren't financially equipped. Right. How are they going to teach their children to be financially equipped? Right. And so I think that, so where do you find this knowledge? I think, there's some great books that I'm happy to share with you. One of the things that you and I have been talking about is, just working on a class here at the church to kind of guide some folks to, to get on the track that they should be on, to help separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, with like what's important, what's not important, but I think at the end of the day, it's just starting with the basics, man. It's like, hey, look, what are my obligations? Let's put that in this fixed bucket. And then whatever's left is what I can afford to spend on the variable stuff, and if there's not enough, then, it's like, what are you earning? And should you be earning more? I mean, maybe you work 2 jobs, I mean, it's like, and that doesn't mean necessarily that you got yourself here. I believe that, our society and the world has kind of put us all here intentionally, so that we're more reliant on, the people in control. Right. And so I think it's a matter of like acknowledging that idea, even if it's not 100% true, but ultimately to encourage people to take control, and do what they have to do. So, long-winded way to say that it's not necessarily easy, but focusing on what you can control.
Right.
And being aware that most of what the world puts out is fix it fast. And that usually doesn't work.
Yeah. I really like that you mentioned that, because I think a lot of times by trying to fix it fast, they end up making it worse than what they did in the first place. Right.
Right.
And so that is some really good advice. Well, Brian has all kinds of additional advice, and if you kind of like to speak to Brian, one-on-one or whatever, I know he would be open to that. So I just want to encourage, if you know him, stop and talk to him. Let him know what you thought about the podcast. If you don't know who he is, you can reach out to me, and I can get you in touch with them. I like the idea, Brian, like we've talked, that maybe in the near future, in the next few months, whether it's another Bible class or like a small group that meets on a Sunday evening, or like just something, that there'd be an avenue for people who are really wanting to make that change. And you've got to want to, right?
You do. Yeah. I use the analogy. It's like, getting a personal trainer, at the end of the beginning of every year, right? Everybody wants to get in shape. So they go sign up with a gym membership. Right. But, with finance, it's like most of the work's going to be on you. There's no one trick that it's like, here, you're fixed. Right. And so, it's retuning the way that you relate with money. And that takes time, right? And I just one more thing too that I think is important for me to acknowledge, at least, is I view our responsibility and time, treasure, and talent. And so like I've learned to help people with this, and so I just want to make sure that like the message that we're sending is like, listen, I'm willing to talk to people for free. This is an investment of my time that, like, particularly with folks at our church and people that are hurting and in need, there's no strings attached, right? And so these are skills that I've learned over time, and I'm certainly not the best out there, but man, I'm willing to talk to anybody and if you're willing to invest time, I'm willing to invest time with you.
Nice. I appreciate that. Well, thanks so much, Brian. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this episode of God Talk. I look forward to talking to you again next week. God bless.